back, everyone. This is Just Two Assholes Fantasy Football Podcast. This is episode 15, and I'm Matt Bowen.
And I'm Daniel Powell.
And yeah, so episode 15, we've made it. It's week 9 now in the season. We're recording a little late, so it is Saturday night, so we're going to post this as soon as we can. But since we're recording late, we're just going to go straight up to the matchups.
We'll start off with my matchup. So this is going to be the Meme Team Dream Team versus Wide Right. In this matchup, I've got myself winning this one. I'm going to pick myself every single week, but this is a fairly easy matchup for me this week, I think. Wide Right has a couple players that I really don't trust this week, but I'll start off by talking about my team. So I'm starting Jared Goff, Christian McCaffrey, James White, Mike Evans, Julian Edelman, Kyle Rudolph, Tariq Cohen, the Vikings defense, and Harrison Butker. Right now, the only question mark on my team is Julian Edelman. He is questionable right now with a foot illness is what they were calling it. He had a foot injury and an illness at the same time. But it looks like he's practiced every day this week, so he's more than likely going to play. The only question I really have is if I want to start him, Sammy Watkins, or Cortland Sutton, because I did pick up Sutton off free agency, and I hyped him up a lot last week, so I feel like for the podcast, I need to start Sutton. But with Watkins and Edelman there, it's really hard to trust Sutton over those two. So right now it's really between Edelman and Watkins. I've got Edelman in there now. Watkins is projected for more points because Cleveland has been pretty bad against number 2 wide receivers. So I expect a lot of Denzel Ward on Tyreek Hill. But they moved Tyreek Hill around so much that I think Denzel Ward could see a lot of Sammy Watkins too. Watkins did pop off last week for 26 fantasy points with 2 touchdowns and almost 100 receiving yards, or over 100 receiving yards possibly. Let me double check that real quick. Yeah, he had 107 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns for 26 fantasy points. Great game from him, but you can't rely on that type of production from Watkins every single week, whereas Edelman, I can pretty much rely on him to get me over 10 fantasy points every single week. He had 15.5 last week, 11.5 before that, 13 the week before that. So the past 3 weeks, he's been very, very consistent. And against Green Bay, New England's going to have to throw the ball quite a lot, just like the Rams did. I talked last week about starting Jared Goff and all the Rams wide receivers. No one knew that, I think it was Josh Reynolds was going to be the one to catch 2 touchdown passes. But that's why I've got Edelman in my starting lineup right now. And I don't see that changing before tomorrow, honestly. Players on my team I really like this week. Christian McCaffrey against Tampa Bay. That's a great matchup. James White against Green Bay. Like I said, they're going to have to throw the ball a lot. Sony Michel should be back, so James White isn't going to see the rushes that he saw last week, but he should still see plenty of receptions out of the backfield. Mike Evans against Carolina. Carolina's been pretty good against opposing wide receivers. They are 9th in the league this year, but Mike Evans is just such a red zone threat that there's no way I can bench him for anyone, any week really. Kyle Rudolph has been a weak spot on my team, but he's a top 10 tight end right now. He just hasn't caught a touchdown pass since week 3. I keep saying he's due, and he is. At some point, he has to catch a touchdown pass and get me a couple more fantasy points. So hopefully it's this week, but even if he doesn't, I'm not too worried about this matchup, honestly. I know that sounds cocky and that I'm just hyping my team up against what I think is an inferior team, even though they do have the same record as me, but I think this is an easy win for me.
Yeah, so I picked you as well, so I picked the Meme Team Dream Team in this matchup. It seems like most of our picks are going to be pretty similar this week. But yeah, so I'll talk about Wide Right. So he's got Cam Newton against Tampa Bay. This is a favorable matchup, especially since he's been so mobile. He actually came out last week, so he had 27 points last week, which is... He's averaging 23 points a game, which is pretty high for him. So he's he's ranked number 6 quarterback in the league so far. So he's been able to put it together. And the big thing for him is he only has 4 interceptions the entire year. So it's good on him. He's not turning the ball over. And especially against Tampa Bay, this is not a team that you have to worry about their pass defense. So not a lot of teams are rushing high against Tampa Bay, but that's because they're going to the pass because their secondary is just so horrible. So I like this matchup for him. But McCoy, so last week in the game against New England, he had, I believe, 12 rushes for 13 yards. Yeah. And he did get 12 points because he added another 80 or 90 yards in passing. But just that team, and I mean, they're starting Perryman again. So I don't have any hopes for Buffalo at all, especially against Chicago, which has been pretty stout against the running offenses. So I do not like that matchup for him. Tevin Coleman this is a tough matchup for him going against Washington, that heavy defensive line. Like, Tevin Coleman does go more horizontal than up and down the field, but, I mean, this is not a good matchup at all for him as well. I think Washington is top 10. Let's see, they're 7th in the league against the rush. The most points that they gave up was against New Orleans, and that's when, what's his name, Mark Ingram came back and had 2 touchdowns by himself. So I'm not looking for a good matchup for him. Antonio Brown, I see this week as either Baltimore is going to cover Antonio Brown or Juju, and I'm leaning towards Juju just because their number 1 cornerback is going to be on Antonio Brown, so Juju's going to get the stuff over the middle. So Antonio Brown, knowing him though, he could still go off for 100 yards and a touchdown, get those big passes with Ben. But yeah, this is not a favorable matchup. Baltimore's pretty stout. They're 5th against wide receivers. So in a total, they only let up 22 points last week. Randall Cobb, he is hurt. He's questionable, and they're playing New England. So I do see this as a high-scoring game, but let's see. Okay, so he was a full participant for hamstring, so that's good news for him. Just overall, I do like your team better. Wide right does have some tough matchups. Like Jordan Reed against Atlanta, that's a favorable matchup, but I just don't like Jordan Reed this year. I mean, he's finally been able to be healthy, but he's not producing. His only game that he had over 10 points was 12 points in Week 1 against Arizona, which we all know how bad their team is this year. So it seems like Washington's winning has come not through Jordan Reed. They're just not using him how he used to be. And surprisingly, because Alex Smith came from Kansas City and he had Kelsey, which he used so much. But with Jordan Reed, they just have such a good offensive running back right now with Adrian Peterson. He's turned back time, and he's just running the hell out of that ball. They're not having to go to their tight end. They're not having to check down. They actually have a stable running back, which they're just handing it off, so that does hurt his production. Taylor Gabriel for Chicago, he's really their number 3 on their team. They are playing against Buffalo, but I know I'm kind of just shitting on wide right, but I don't like this team really this week. He has the Chiefs defense against Cleveland, and the Chiefs defense the last couple weeks has been able to put some points up, has been able to have some touchdowns. So against Cincinnati 2 weeks ago, they had the touchdowns. They had 17.5 points. And against Denver with Case Keenum, they got 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery. So they are turning it around a little bit, getting some more turnovers. So I expect to see 10 to 12 points out of them, especially against Cleveland with Greg Williams. Is that his name?
Yeah,
Greg Williams being the head coach now. I see them to be running the ball a lot with Nick Chubb. So there might not be a lot of interceptions, but there's probably not going to be a lot of points coming from Cleveland. And then Justin Tucker, we know how good he is against Pittsburgh. He'll probably get 8 to 10 points, but that's going to be a tough divisional matchup. But yeah, overall, I do like meme team, but on wide right's bench, I don't see anyone that he could fill in. It's kind of a rough week for him. He's got 3 out of his 5 players on the bench on buys. I wouldn't start Matt Ryan over Cam Newton, and then Ito Smith, I wouldn't start him over Coleman or McCoy. So, yeah, it's a tough matchup, and sorry, guy, you're going to lose this week.
Yeah, this is a tough spot for him. If I were him, I think I'd be trying to shop Cam Newton right now. He's riding a really, really strong wave, and I think you could get a decent starting running back or a pretty good starting wide receiver out of another team who desperately needs a quarterback. I know of at least one team this week who has a quarterback on a bye week and no one else on their team at the quarterback position. So I'd be throwing Cam Newton their way and saying, hey, give me a starting running back, or hey, give me a starting wide receiver, someone I can put on this team that's going to score some points. And then I'd start Matt Ryan, or I'd stream a quarterback over Cam Newton. But yeah, that's the only roster move I can see him making right now that would make a big difference and sort of put him back in this game. ESPN is projecting him to lose right now by, 8 points. I think I'm going to win by a bigger margin than that. I think that's just ESPN being very, very hopeful with a couple of his players. It's just a tough week for him, man.
Yeah, so we'll move on to my game. So one Tyreek Hill versus Steroid Evans. And like yourself, I'm going to pick myself in this team, or in this matchup, so I'll talk about me a little bit. So right now I'm favored by 5 points, but that was before the Thursday night game. So Steroid Evans lost 2.5 points because they started Oakland's defense. Surprisingly, it's only 2.5 because they didn't get any picks. They didn't get any turnovers at all, no sacks. It was just points scored against, which they got 34 points against them. So they're already in the hole, which is looking better for me. So I have Matthew Stafford for quarterback against Minnesota, which this should be a decent matchup for him. So Minnesota is 18th against quarterbacks, which is right in the middle of the pack, a little bit out of the top 15. So I do like this for Matthew Stafford. He did lose a weapon, though. So Golden Tate is out, but they were really for the 2 wide receiver sets. Golden Tate wasn't even playing. They were already putting Joey Galladay over him. So I don't see too much of a drop, just more Galladay in this game. And hopefully they give the ball to Kerryon Johnson, unlike they did last week where they only gave him to it 8 times. But yeah, I like this matchup for Matthew Stafford. Todd Gurley, we've already talked about, he's the number 1 running back in the league. They are playing New Orleans, which is 6th against the running backs. So this is going to be a tougher matchup, but I don't think you can slow down Todd Gurley. Maybe he won't get 3 touchdowns. He'll probably still get 2 because he has those goal line touches as well. But he's just so dangerous in the passing game as well. You saw how at the end of the last game, it was pretty it was a big deal that he did not run into in the end zone and score that touchdown. He was just so smart that he knew that, hey, we had to run out the clock, and that's why he's just such a great player overall, not just in fantasy. He knows how to win the game. And luckily, I didn't need that touchdown last week, or I would have been cursing him as well. But he's just such a great football player. So I like this matchup. Phillip Lindsay against Houston. So Freeman is still banged up. He was limited, or he did not practice Wednesday, Thursday, and then he was limited on Friday. So I'm not looking for really, but maybe 5 carries from him. He's still hurt, especially against Houston's defense, because their defense is pretty stout. They really are. So overall, they are number 3 in the league, but against the run, they're 14th. So this is a pretty good matchup for Phillip Lindsay. We know how they can't rely on Case Keenum too much, so they have to go to the running game a lot. And his, like I said in the previous podcast, his ability of catching the ball in the backfield just adds value, adds fantasy value to him so much. I have Tyreek Hill against Cleveland. I love this matchup. Yes, you said that Ward might be shadowing him, but they move him around. They use him so much in sweeps. Sometimes he's in for running back. He takes the top off the defense for a Sammy Watkins, but he always gets his. Even last week, he only had 3 catches for 70 yards. But that was, that's still 8.5 points, which, hey, you like to get a lot more, but, hey, he's due for a touchdown. He's only had 1 the last 2 weeks, so I'm looking a big game for him. Probably 20, 25 points from him. I love this matchup. And thankfully, so Stephon Diggs has been ruled out with a rib injury, and they're ruling him out probably just to rest him for a lot of weeks because next week they're on a bye. So he's going to get 2 weeks of full rest, especially for a rib injury. That's tough in football to play with. So thankfully, Cooper Kupp is back. He's participated full all this week, and they're going to need him against New Orleans. When he is in there, he's their number 1 scoring wide receiver for the Rams. Jared Goff loves going to him. Sean McVay just finds ways to get him the ball. And I look for him to come back with a vengeance after being injured for a couple of weeks. Let's see. So he's averaging 12 points a game, but that's because when he got hurt, he did play in that game, but he only got 1 point, so that takes his average down a lot. But besides that, he had 18 points, 32 points, 15 points, 14.5 points, and then 9 points. So I'm looking for more of a top teen, maybe 18 to 23 points for him. So I love this matchup for him. For my tight end, I had a tough question Austin Hooper, which is 9th ranked, and then Trey Burton, which is 7th ranked in our league. So it's kind of a flip of the coin. I just went with the matchup for this one. So Austin Hooper's playing Washington, which is, they're 13th against tight end. Okay. But then Trey Burton's playing Buffalo. And I see this as a high-scoring game. I think Mitchell Trubisky is going to go out there and light it up. And I think Khalil Mack is going to feast on Perriman. So I think the offense is going to have the ball in their hands a lot, which just gives more opportunities for Trey Burton to score. For my flex, with Stephon Diggs being out, I kind of had to make a risk. So I picked Devontae Parker as one of my sleepers in the last episode. And so I'm going with him in my flex over John Brown. John Brown has been really big for Baltimore for the long ball, but he's a boomer bust player. So he's averaging 12 points a game, but I'm just hoping that the Dolphins, they have no one else to throw to. Kenny Stills is still injured. He's not going to play. And we talked about how Albert Wilson's on the IR. Damian Amendola is there, but they don't really use Mike Gesicki is their tight end in the passing game too much. So Devontae Parker, I'm hoping you have a big game, come out for over 100 yards, and hopefully you catch a touchdown this week. And then for Cowboys defense against Tennessee, Tennessee's only averaging 16 points a game this week, and they're allowing. Okay, so they're only 29th as well for fantasy for defenses. Where the Cowboys, they are. Let's see, where are they ranked? So the Cowboys are averaging 8 points a game this week for defense, so that's pretty decent. For Washington, they did let up a lot of points and didn't have any interceptions or fumble recoveries, but Irving is back on their defensive line, so that's going to be a really tough matchup for Peterson. He has lit it up this year, but the Cowboys' run defense is pretty stout this year, so I like that matchup. And then Dan Bailey, ever since he's been signed by Minnesota, he's been a great kicker for me. He only did get 1 point, I believe, last week, or 2 points, so hopefully he gets closer to the 8 to 12 point range. But yeah, once again, I'm going with myself to win over Stairway to Evans.
Yeah, I'm picking you to win in this matchup too, and a lot of it comes down to Stairway to Evans. He played the Raiders defense against the Niners. Nick Mullins popped off and scored 34 points, and the Raiders defense got negative 2.5 fantasy points. So really, really tough start for him, and it's one of the big reasons why I'm picking you in this matchup. The other reason is, so Stairway to Evans, the strength of this team is really in his wide receivers core. He's got Julio Jones, Michael Thomas, and Juju Smith-Schuster. 3 very, very good starting fantasy wide receivers, but they all have really tough matchups this week. Julio Jones is playing Washington, so he's going to see a lot of Josh Norman. We already know he doesn't catch touchdowns, so points are going to be hard to come by for him. Michael Thomas is playing the Rams. The Rams have that amazing pass rush and pretty good cornerbacks. So it's going to be tough for Drew Brees to get the time to throw to Michael Thomas. I still think Michael Thomas is his best wide receiver this week. He'll probably still get a decent amount of fantasy points, but I don't see him getting enough to win Stairway to Evans this game. And then Juju Smith-Schuster is playing Baltimore. Baltimore is one of the best fantasy defenses and overall defenses in the league. They are currently 5th against opposing wide receivers. Roethlisberger is getting older. He's a lot slower. Their pass rush is really good. I don't like this matchup for most of Pittsburgh's players, but especially Juju Smith-Schuster and Antonio Brown. Luckily for Stairway to Evans, he does have 2 running backs who normally you wouldn't think of as being the best fantasy running backs in the world, Adrian Peterson and Lamar Miller, but they both have favorable matchups this week. Adrian Peterson is going to face off against Atlanta. Atlanta is currently 30th in our league against opposing running backs, and Peterson has been feasting lately. Lamar Miller had a really good game last week, and he is facing off against Denver, who is currently, 24th against opposing running backs. So if Stairway to Evans is going to win this game, it's going to come on the back of Adrian Peterson and Lamar Miller, I think, and then maybe Michael Thomas getting a touchdown or 2. Maybe Julio Jones will finally see a touchdown, but that's what he needs to happen. He's starting Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback against Carolina. I like Fitzpatrick a lot fantasy-wise, but I don't like him when he's been named the starter. When Ryan Fitzpatrick knows that he's the starter, he seems to play much, much worse. We saw last week he came in for Jameis Winston, only played one half of football, but threw for 194 yards and 2 touchdowns, but that was in relief, and that's just what Fitzpatrick does. It doesn't help that Carolina is 15th in the league against opposing quarterbacks, so right middle of the road, so not great, but not bad either. They only gave up 15 points to Joe Flacco, 18 to Carson Wentz, 15 to Alex Smith. So this is a interesting matchup for Ryan Fitzpatrick, but it's one that I don't really like just because of the narrative and how Fitzpatrick performs not nearly as well when he knows that he is the guy. The rest of his team, he's got O.J. Howard at tight end against Carolina. I like O.J. Howard most weeks. Fitzpatrick does like throwing him the ball, especially in the red zone. He's a really good fantasy tight end, so I like that matchup there. And then Dustin Hopkins against Atlanta. I could see Washington scoring quite a few points in this game, so I think Hopkins has a pretty good matchup. But overall, because of the strength of the defenses playing his wide receivers and the fact that his defense already got negative 2 points, I'm going with your team in this matchup.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about Ryan Fitzpatrick, and the biggest thing that I was looking at this week is he hasn't faced a defense that plays zone at all, and this year, and so he has been lights on when he's been the starter. But like you said, he's always had Jameis Winston in the background, just waiting to take advantage of him when he's came back from his suspension. But Carolina plays zone defense, so I don't see them getting burnt a lot by Mike Evans or Deshaun Jackson. So I do see a lower scoring game for him. Hopefully he doesn't score 40 points against me. But yeah, with his wide receivers having really tough matchups. And so I'm glad you're picking me. Let's move on to the next game. So I'm going to go to Sack Like Matters versus Fournette. So in this one, I believe you're picking the same, but we're going with a Fournette son.
Yes, I'm picking Fournette's son in this matchup, and so are you. And a lot of it comes down to, so Fournette's son has already had 2 players play. He had Robbie Gould, kicker for the Niners, get 10 fantasy points, and Doug Martin in his flex get 6.5 fantasy points. Decent games out of both. Doug Martin, you don't expect a whole lot more than that. You kind of wish he would have got a touchdown, but Oakland didn't score any touchdowns in that matchup, and Doug Martin really was their best player on the field last week. And then for Sack Lives Matter, he had Marquise Goodwin in his flex, who only got 1.5 fantasy points. So Sack Lives Matter is already losing 1.5 to 16.5. On top of that, he's only projected to score 73.3 fantasy points this week. It's just that's a tough go for him. On Fournette's son, players I really like this week. Aaron Rodgers against New England. There's going to be a lot of passing yards in this game. I think it's going to be fairly high scoring. Rodgers should have a pretty good game. Kareem Hunt against Cleveland. Cleveland is 25th in the league against opposing running backs, and Kareem Hunt has really turned it on lately. I projected he'd get 25 fantasy points. Last week he didn't. He got 16.5, which is still pretty good. And I expect more of the same this week against Cleveland. Aaron Jones has really grabbed a hold of that number 1 running back spot for Green Bay, and that's his RB2. And with Ty Montgomery being gone, Aaron Jones is going to be the de facto pass catcher out of the backfield as well. So I like this for him against New England. He's got Kenny Galladay and Tyler Lockett in his wide receiver spots. Galladay is that solidified number 2 wide receiver now with Golden Tate being traded, so he's going to see quite a few targets and probably quite a few receptions over the middle, and they're going to really rely on him for some yak and first down, so I like this spot for him. Minnesota has been a lot better lately against opposing wide receivers, giving up only 13 points to wide receivers against New Orleans, 9 points against the Jets, 16.5 against Arizona. So points are hard to come by lately against the Vikings, but this is a divisional matchup and one that the Lions absolutely have to win. And when the Lions have to win, they come out throwing the ball because that's Stafford's strength. It's their offense's strength, really. They aren't much of a balanced attack. We've seen that a lot lately. All of their fantasy running back owners are really mad at this team. They have been for years now, and it just keeps happening. So I expect them to throw to Galladay quite a bit. Lockett against the Chargers. Tyler Lockett is very boom or bust, but he's had a pretty solid fantasy season so far. He's averaging 12 fantasy points per game. He had 11 last week against Detroit, 16.5 against the Rams. So he's had some decent weeks, and I expect more of the same out of him this week. I think 12 fantasy points is a pretty good benchmark for him. Vance McDonald in his tight end spot against Baltimore. Baltimore has been, 20th in the league against opposing tight ends. So this is a good spot for Vance McDonald to finally do some damage again. He had a decent fantasy season early on. He had 19 points against Tampa Bay in week 3, 6.5 against Baltimore in week 4, who they are playing this week. So if you can get 6.5 to 10 fantasy points out of Vance McDonald this week, I think you're pretty happy there. The Jets defense against Miami starting Brock Osweiler. I know he's looked pretty good so far this year, but anytime Brock Osweiler is the starting quarterback, I want to start the opposing defense against him. I just don't trust him. I don't care how good he's looked in the past couple weeks, so I like the Jets defense here as well.
Yeah, it was a real tough matchup, but yeah, I went with Fournette's son as well. But yeah, like the biggest thing for me, like you said, is Fournette's son already had 2 players with 16.5. Sack Lives had 1.5, and for Marquise Goodwin only get 1.5 points. He's starting for running backs too for Trenton Cannon and Frank Gore. So Trenton Cannon,
that's tough.
So he's kind of had to been forced into Bilal Powers' role since he had his neck injury. But on the games that he's played, he has scored. So he's rushed for 6 times for 15 yards against Detroit, only 1.5 points. He's rushed for 6 times for 10 yards, only 3.5 points. So he does not get a lot of yards per average on the ground. He does have a more favorable matchup going against Miami's defense. Their defensive line has been really stripped so far with injuries, but yeah, I don't like that matchup at all. So just off of those 2 players, Trenton Cannon and Marquise Goodwin, I could see maybe 10 points out of 2 players. So that is just bad. That is bad to look at for a weekly output for your players. So Mitchell Trubisky, I've already spoke to how I like this matchup for him going against Buffalo. He's averaging 21 points a game so far because he adds the run game a little bit for him. And like I already said, I look for Chicago to have the ball in their hands a lot. So Buffalo is third against opposing quarterbacks, but that's only because that they shut down Minnesota Vikings that 1 week against, so that was week 1 where Kirk Cousins only had 230 yards and 1 touchdown. So that is really the outlier. And then they played Tennessee, which Marcus Mariota only threw for 130 yards. I think that Mitchell Trubisky is better than not better than Cousins. Sorry, I didn't want to say that. But I think he's better than Mariota. And I just see that Chicago's offense is going to have the ball in their hands so much that there's no way that he can score less than 15 points. Trenton Cannon, I already spoke about how I do not like him in his lineup, but it's hard with injuries. With bye weeks coming in, the only other player he could fill in be Theo Reddick, which since they have turned to Kerryon Johnson, his production has gone down, and he has missed the past 2 weeks, and he's questionable to go into week 9, so he's not someone you can rely on and throw into your lineup. So there's nothing really Sack Lives Matters can do this week. Marvin Jones Jr., so it's funny, he is Sack Lives has Marvin Jones Jr., and then Ain't No Fournette's son has what the hell?
Kenny Galladay.
Yeah, Kenny Galladay. Sorry, I lost it. So with Golden Tate being traded, that should be up for both players. But since they're going against each other, I think they might even each other up or even each other out. Sorry. But Xavier Rhodes has been out the past 3 weeks, and he is coming back. So that's going to be even worse for Detroit's wide receivers. I do see Matt Stafford having a big week, and it is a must-win, really, for Detroit, especially in the divisional game. So Marvin Jones Jr. could have 15 to 20 points. That is a good matchup for him. Robert Woods against the Saints. So the Saints defense against wide receivers is last, 32nd in the league. So earlier this week, in our last episode, I put Los Angeles Rams receivers as who I just loved for my wide receivers. So I do see a big games for Robert Woods. It does tick down just a little bit, though, that Cooper Kupp is coming back. So he is going to take a lot of those catches and touchdowns. But Robert Woods still could go out for maybe 6 catches for 80 yards and maybe squeak out a touchdown. So he could have a big week. So the only 3 players that I see having a great week this week is Marvin Jones Jr., Robert Woods, and Mitchell Trubisky. Besides that, David Njoku has really fallen off the earth. So he had 0 catches, 0 receptions last week, and off of only 1 target. So he had 0 points. And then against Tampa Bay, who is just a horrible defense, he got 1 touchdown, but only 4 catches for 52 yards. So he really didn't have too much production that week at all. So it seems, and like I said, with Cleveland, with them firing their head coach, it's good for Cleveland, but with Greg Williams, a defensive coordinator and defensive-minded head coach, I don't see any improvements at all for that offense. So I don't see a really good week for David Njoku as well. They are playing Kansas City. We talked about how they're turning around. They're starting their defense a little bit. So I don't like this matchup for him as well. We talked about Marquise Goodwin and his flex only getting 1.5 against Oakland. The Dolphins' defense against the Jets. So, yeah, they are playing Sam Darnold, but I'm a Dolphins fan myself. And it's sad to say, but I want to root for them, but they've just been hit by so many injuries, and I think that Sam Darnold could have a pretty good game as long as he doesn't throw any picks. And then Matt Prater, his defense going in the week and going against Minnesota. Minnesota's offense has been pretty high-powered this year. So I could see maybe 5 points out of Matt Prater. But, yeah, so going against Minnesota. So I do like I Ain't No Fournette's son, and sorry, Sack Lives Matter. It looks like you're going to go to 4-5.
Yeah, just a tough week here for Sack Lives Matter. He's got 4 players on bye weeks. Saquon Barkley, A.J. Green, Evan Ingram, and Nelson Aguilar are all on bye weeks. 3 of those players are instant must-starters. So this is really, really tough for him. Really tough week. So sorry, Josh. Sorry, Sack Lives Matter, but we got to go Fournette's son in this matchup. Moving on to the Lucky Neckbeards versus Jimmy G Spot Rockers. We both have Lucky Neckbeards in this matchup, and it's mainly because Lucky Neckbeards are 7-1. They've been killing it. They're scoring like 120 fantasy points every single week. Their roster is absolutely stacked. But I'll talk about Jimmy G Spot Rockers in this matchup. If they want to keep it close, it's going to come down to Drew Brees having a good game against the Rams, which is very iffy. That's kind of tough. Nick Chubb has to have a really good game against Kansas City. Greg Williams might help Nick Chubb a bit because typically defensive-minded head coaches want to pound the rock and really weaken and slow down that defense. So Nick Chubb could see 22 to 25 carries and maybe get 100 yards and a touchdown. That'd be huge for him and really help G-Spot Rockers in this matchup. Kerryon Johnson against Minnesota. I don't even know what to say about Kerryon Johnson. He should be getting 20 touches every single game, but he just isn't. He had that 1 week against Miami where he saw 19 rushes, and off those 19 rushes, he had 158 rushing yards and 18 fantasy points. That's the kind of production he can get you when he touches the ball 20 times a game, but it just doesn't seem to happen. And in this matchup, I think that the Lions are going to be down by quite a bit, and they're going to be relying on Matthew Stafford's big arm to throw the ball a lot. So I just don't see Kerryon Johnson rushing a whole lot. He might have a few passes and get you 30, 40 receiving yards or something like that, but I think this is a really tough spot for him. Then you got Keenan Allen against Seattle. Seattle has been amazing against opposing offenses. They are 12th in the league against opposing wide receivers. So if you're going to score points on the Seahawks, it's got to be with your wide receivers. Keenan Allen is one of the best wide receivers in the league, especially when it comes to just his hands and his route running. He's had an okay fantasy year so far. He's averaging 10 fantasy points per game. It's not what you would expect from Keenan Allen because he hasn't had a touchdown since week 1. So this could be the week where he kind of bounces back and sees a touchdown or two, but going off persistence, I just don't see that happening. Chris Godwin in his wide receiver 2 spot against Carolina. I don't like this matchup at all. Chris Godwin has been not so great the past couple weeks, but that was with Jameis Winston at quarterback. But Carolina is a pretty good defense with pretty good cornerbacks. They're 9th in the league against opposing wide receivers, and Godwin just isn't that good of a wide receiver. I think that Tampa Bay is going to rely much more on Mike Evans and O.J. Howard in the passing game here. And Chris Godwin could see 5 catches for 55 yards or something like that and get you like 7.5, 8 fantasy points. So not a great matchup for him. He's starting Chris Herndon in his tight end spot. That's tough, man. He's averaging 4.8 fantasy points per game. He has been much better the past couple of weeks, though. 12 points against Indy in Week 6, 12 against Minnesota in Week 7, and then 7.5 against Chicago. So he has been seeing quite a bit more of the offensive share. Maybe Sam Darnold is kind of figuring out who his number 1 tight end is, and maybe it's Herndon. He does have a touchdown in each of the past 3 weeks as well. I don't know if he can keep that up this week, though. Miami's defense is fairly weak. As you said, they've gone through tons of injuries, and they are 22nd in the league against opposing tight ends, but I just can't trust Chris Herndon to be that guy 4 weeks in a row. He's starting Kenyon Drake in his flex spot. This is one player I really like a lot because Kenyon Drake has turned it on the past couple of weeks. 19.5 points against Cincinnati in Week 5, 16 against Detroit in Week 7, and 21 against Houston in Week 8. The Jets' defense is decent. They're not the best. They're 19th in the league against opposing running backs, but they don't do that well against running backs who can catch the ball. Tariq Cohen absolutely tore them up last week. Phillip Lindsay had a huge game against them in Week 5. TJ Yeldon tore him up in Week 4. So running backs who can catch the ball like Kenyon Drake does really have good games against the Jets. So this is probably my favorite player on his team this week. And then he's got the Texans defense against Denver. Texans defense has been really, really strong this year. J.J. Watt's turned it back on. They are the number 2 fantasy defense in the league right now. So I think this is a spot where they could have a pretty good game against Case Keenum. Keenum does like throwing interceptions, so that maybe they get a pick 6 and score you 15 fantasy points. That'd be really nice. And then Brett Maher against Tennessee. Maher is averaging 9.9 fantasy points per game. He's 7th in the league right now as far as kickers go. So this could be a good spot for him as well if Dallas really turns it on. But most games with Tennessee in them are really slow and really boring. This game could end up like something like 14-10 or something like that with Zeke Elliott getting 2 touchdowns. So Brett Maher might only see 2 fantasy points here. It's a rough week for Jimmy G Spot Rockers. You need Drew Brees to pop off. You need Keenan Allen to pop off, and you need Kenyon Drake to pop off. If those 3 things happen, you have an outside shot of maybe stealing a win here, but Lucky Neckbeard's team is just too strong.
Yeah, someone needs to take this guy down because, like you said, he's 7-1. He's first in my division, and sadly, it doesn't look like Jimmy G Spot Rockers is going to do that this week. So Jimmy G, he is hurt because by bye weeks. I mean, Odell's on a bye, Zach Ertz is on a bye, so he has been able to move some. He's been forced to move some players in the starting lineup that usually wouldn't be there. So yeah, we both do like Lucky Neckbeard, so I'll talk about them. So Kirk Cousins has been great this year, and they are playing against Detroit. But yeah, Kirk Cousins is averaging 21 points. That is solid for a starting quarterback in this league. And let's see, he's fourth so far for points. So hey, just keep that going. Especially Darius Slay is a little bit beat up. The Lions defense is 22nd in the league against quarterbacks, so this is a favorable matchup for Kirk Cousins. And just to double down on that, he has Adam Thielen, which he's going for, I believe it's 9 straight weeks. Yep, 9. He's trying to do 9 straight weeks and break the record of the longest games, 100 yards or more for receiving. So hey, just keep going. In the last 5 weeks, he's had 100 yards and a touchdown. So far in 8 weeks, he's had 6 touchdowns through the air. So hey, just especially with Stephon Diggs being ruled out, this just increases his value so much more against Detroit, especially with Darius Slay being hurt and their defense not being great against the wide receivers. Let's see. Melvin Gordon. So it's kind of false. I mean, he's listed as questionable, but he hasn't played the last 2 weeks. So he didn't play in the London game, and then they're on a bye week, and he's been limited in the first game or in the first practice, but ever since then he's been full on Thursday and Friday for practice for Melvin Gordon. So I look to see full strength Melvin Gordon with his pass catching ability and his great rushing ability as well. Seattle was kind of middle of the pack. They're 13th in the league against running backs. But last week it's kind of skewed a little bit. So last week they only let up, I think, 6 points. Let's see. So 12 points against Detroit, but we've already talked about that's the game that they did not run Kerryon Johnson. So I think that's a little bit skewed for Seattle. I do like this matchup for Melvin Gordon. James Conner, however, though, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. So Lucky Neckbeards has James Conner, but then he's starting the Ravens defense. So if James Conner scores, that's going to hurt his defense. If he doesn't, it's going to help his defense, but that's going to hurt James Conner. Baltimore is first in the league so far against running backs. So this is going to be a tough matchup. But James Conner, just the player he's been so far this year, he's averaging 22 points. He's the number 1 fantasy scoring, or the number 3, fantasy scoring running back so far this year. He's only had 1 game below 10 points, and that was against Baltimore. So he had 6.5 points. He's been a little bit more comfortable in the offense, so I'm looking for him to get only 10 points. But hey, that is a very down week for James Conner, but with Melvin Gordon, he kind of doesn't need him. And luckily, he goes against Jimmy G Spot Rockers, who had to throw some players in his lineup that usually shouldn't be there. So it does help Lucky Neckbeards that he's playing Jimmy G Spot this week. We already talked about Adam Thielen. Another wide receiver is Danny Amendola. So he's kind of been forced to play him as well because he has 4 players on the bye. And the only other active player not on a bye is Le'Veon Bell, and right now he's not under contract at all. So he had no option but to put Danny Amendola in there. So the last 2 weeks, though, he's kind of turning it on. So against Detroit, he had 5 catches for 84 yards and a touchdown, so 17 points. Against Houston, he had 5 catches for 43 yards, but no touchdown. But he still got 11.5 points because he runs the ball just slightly. So he could get 8 to 12 points out of Danny Amendola, and with pretty much all the rest of his team on his bench on buys, that's pretty decent out of Danny Amendola. And his next 2 players are both players for the Panthers. So Greg Olsen for tight end, and then DJ Moore, who has turned it around in his flex spot. He's a wide receiver. And they're playing against Tampa Bay, which is last in the league against pass catching. So they're last against tight ends, or they're 31st, sorry. And then they're 31st against wide receivers. So not last, but they're at the bottom of the barrel. They pretty much should be last. Greg Olsen, ever since coming back from injury, has been decent. So he had 4 catches for 48 yards. Okay. But then he scored a touchdown the previous 2 weeks after that. So he should at least have another touchdown this game. But his role in that offense ever since he's been coming back has been increasing. So I'm looking for him to get 6 to 7 catches for at least 100 yards in this game. Maybe 80 to 100. But some of the catches are going to go to DJ Moore. So he's kind of stepped in. They released Torrey Smith this week. So it's solidified. DJ Moore is their number 2, but just a little bit behind Devin Funchess. But DJ Moore is just a lot more explosive than Devin Funchess is. Devin Funchess is more that big wide receiver that's a red zone target, but DJ Moore just has the speed. So last week he had 5 catches for 90 yards, no touchdowns. He's only had 1 touchdown so far this year, but that still got him 14.5 points. So if you're getting 14.5 out of your flex, that is solid. That is really good. And we've already talked about the Ravens defense. So going against Pittsburgh is pretty high scoring offense, but this is a divisional matchup, and it's at Baltimore. Usually these games are just ugly. They're low-scoring games, so I'm looking for Ravens defense actually to have a pretty good put out. We already talked about how Juju's going to be limited. Same thing with Antonio Brown, and I just spoke about James Conner being unlimited a little bit, having his worst game of the season against Baltimore. So I do like this matchup for the Ravens defense, and then Greg the Leg going to New Orleans. This is going to be a high-scoring game. It really will, and I see Greg the Leg. He's number 1 in our rankings every single week that he's active, and he's averaging 6 points a game. So the last 2, he had 13 and then 8. So if you can get right in the middle, around 10 points for him, this would be solid. And sorry to say, I hate you, Lucky Neck Beers, but you're probably going to get another win this week.
Yeah, this looks like a fairly easy W for the Lucky Neck Beers here, but every single week it looks like a fairly easy W for them. Our only hope is that their players slow down towards the end of the season and someone can take them out in the playoffs, because my God, man, this team just looks so strong. They're running away with everything right now. All right, we'll move on now to Team Cortez versus the Tobias Anal Rapist. So I think I've picked against Team Cortez every single week so far this season. They're 4-4, so they're doing pretty decent, but I'm picking against them again this week. But it comes down to a couple of things. So right now, the Tobias Anal Rapists are starting Carson Wentz and Golden Tate on their team. Carson Wentz is on a bye week. Golden Tate is on a bye week. They have to fix this lineup in order for me to feel really confident in this pick. They don't have another quarterback on their team, which is rough, but they and Will Fuller's also on the IR and starting in their flex spot. So that's 3 teams currently in their starting lineup on Saturday night at 10 p.m. West Coast time that are in their starting lineup right now. This is absolutely insane. Fix your lineup, John. Come on, man. Outside of Carson Wentz, so he's got Mark Ingram and Latavius Murray in his running back spots. I like both of these matchups for them. The Rams defense against Mark Ingram is pretty good, 10th in the league against opposing running backs, but Mark Ingram is their goal line guy, and I expect him to see at least a touchdown. I'd say probably 55 yards and a touchdown, something like that. Good for 12 to 15 fantasy points. Latavius Murray has been on fire lately, and Detroit's defense is not good against the run. They're 27th in the league against opposing running backs. Dalvin Cook is still out, so Murray's going to see all of those touches. I think this is a really good week for him. Look for 19 to 20 fantasy points there. He's got Jarvis Landry in his wide receiver 2 spot. Tough spot for him here. Landry hasn't been all that great lately. Luckily, Kansas City's defense is horrible against opposing wide receivers, but with Greg Williams as your head coach, I just don't know if you can rely on Jarvis Landry seeing the 10 to 12 receptions he needs to see to have a good fantasy day. But I'm holding out hope that that's not going to matter, and he has some pieces that he'll fill in here that will kind of offset the Jarvis Landry letdown that he's about to see. In his tight end spot, he's got Travis Kelce against Cleveland. Kelce is the number 1 tight end every single week. He's currently the number 2 tight end in the league behind Zach Ertz, I believe, unless George Kittle has passed them both up after that Thursday night game. But Kelce is the best tight end in the league. He's really in a tier of his own, I think, as far as big play ability goes. The dude's an absolute monster. Zach Ertz is much more that, you know, he'll see 12 catches a game, something crazy like that. But Kelce only sees 5 or 6 catches a game, but it's almost always for 100 yards, and he sees quite a few big touchdowns as well. So I like this matchup against Cleveland. Cleveland's defense is 15th in the league right now against opposing tight ends, but when they've played good tight ends, so when they played Jared Cook, they gave up 30.5 fantasy points to him. When they played O.J. Howard, 13 fantasy points. So Kelce should have a pretty good game here, so I like that play here. And then the Panthers' defense against Tampa Bay. I talked about how I don't really like Fitzmagic this week because of the narrative, and I think the Panthers could take full advantage of that. I think Fitzmagic could throw 2 or 3 interceptions. Maybe Jameis Winston comes in at halftime, after halftime and starts again, because they don't know what the fuck they're doing there in Tampa Bay. It's a complete shit show, a complete mess. Carolina can take full advantage of that situation. And then he's got Steven Gostkowski against Green Bay. This is going to be a pretty high-scoring matchup, I think, so I like Gostkowski a lot. He's the number 1 fantasy kicker in the league right now. 14 points last week, 15 points against Kansas City. Or 22 points, I mean. He had 5 field goals made. I expect this sort of production out of him in this Green Bay game as well. I think he'll have probably 3 or 4 field goals made, as well as probably 2 or 3 extra points made as well. So that'd be good for anywhere from 15 to 18 fantasy points, I think. So a really good spot for him. On his bench, he does have Zeke Elliott, who he needs to put in his flex over Will Fuller. He needs to fix that immediately. And then he needs to find either stream or trade for a quarterback and get Carson Wentz out of your starting lineup because he is on a bye week. But if those moves are made and he starts Mohamed Sanu over Golden Tate because Tate's on a bye week, I think this is a matchup he can win against Team Cortez.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that Tobias Anarabis is busy tomorrow morning and he doesn't check his lineup because it looks like he hasn't looked at it since last week, especially with Will Fuller still being in there. So, yeah. So I looked at this and was like, okay, Team Cortez, you're going to have an all right week. Right now he's projected for 86 points. Okay. So, but then I looked at Tobias Anarabis and I saw 3 players who weren't going to play, and I was like, I can't pick him. I want to, but I can't. But with Zeke Elliott thrown in that flex, that's going to be a little bit better for him. But with no starting quarterback and having one wide receiver not playing, your other one being Jarvis Landry, which you've already talked about, hasn't done well at all this year, I couldn't pick you Tobias Anarabis. So Team Cortez, I'm picking you. Don't let me down. So I picked you once so far this season, and you lost. But you are 4-4, so I must not be picking you in the weeks that you're winning. So Team Cortez, so he has Deshaun Watson against Denver. So to look at this a little bit, so Denver did let up 26 points against Patrick Mahomes. Deshaun Watson is not Patrick Mahomes, but he is turning it around. He did have 30 points against Miami. He had 5 touchdowns. So it looks like that he's back, at least from his before he got injured last year with that ACL tear in practice. But yeah, I'm looking for a big game for Deshaun Watson. Maybe not the 26 points like Mahomes did, but maybe 20, 22 points against Denver's defense, which is not. It's 10th in the league against quarterbacks, but I just see with Deshaun Watson, they did lose Will Fuller, but they picked up Demaryius Thomas. So there's going to be a little bit of production down a little bit, but with Lamar Miller and that offensive line being healthier, Deshaun Watson's been able to have more time and just have more time to look at his weapons and throw it to him. So I look for a big week for him. Chris Carson is a hard running back, running back, and they're going against the Chargers, which is right in the middle of the pack, 15th in the league. And Chris Carson, he is coming back a little bit from an injury, but last week he came back, and he came back with a vengeance. He had over 100 yards and a touchdown. He got 18 points. I look to see that again. Seattle's really turning around against the Chargers, or against so far these past couple weeks, with Russell Wilson playing out of his mind against Detroit last week. But I like this matchup against the Chargers for Chris Carson. I think he'll have to pound the rock a little bit, have to open up those wide receivers a little bit for Russell Wilson. But I like Chris Carson. I think maybe he doesn't get 100 yards and a touchdown, but 70, 80 yards and a touchdown, hey, I'll take that any day. Chris Ivory, I do not like this move at all. He did have more points than McCoy last week with 4.5, but he rushed 6 times for 34 yards. But we kind of laughed at this move last 2 weeks. He started him as running back, but with David Johnson being on a bye, he still has Marshawn Lynch on his bench, which he's on IR. He has no one else for a running back to put in, so he's got to stick with Chris Ivory. But going against Chicago, I do not like this matchup at all. They are a pretty stout defense against the run. They are second in the league against the run, so I do not like this matchup for Chris Ivory. Brandon Cooks, so I already talked about how I love the Rams wide receivers this week against New Orleans. I look for him to maybe get 12 to 18 points this week, which would be pretty decent for him. Michael Crabtree going against Pittsburgh. I talked about how this is going to be an ugly game, but Pittsburgh's defense against wide receivers are 28th. So I can see Crabtree getting some points over the middle, getting some catches over the middle, and getting maybe 8 to 10 catches. No, maybe not 10, but 6 to 8 catches for maybe 70 yards. And that'll be close to 10 points for him. So against going Tobias Anarabis, who is Tate, getting 0 points right now, that is a plus for his wide receivers with Cook and Crabtree. And then he's going with Gronkowski in his tight end. He has not been the Gronk as usual, but they're going against Green Bay. Gronk does come up with big plays when they need him down the stretch. So I look for this game to – honestly, I think this is going to be probably the best game of the week besides the Rams against New Orleans. I think this is going to come down to the last second or 2-minute drill, and they're going to go to Gronk if New England has the ball. So I'm looking for him to maybe get 10 to 12 points against Green Bay. Deshaun Jackson against Carolina. We already talked about how we do not like Tampa Bay against Carolina, how Carolina's defense has been pretty good this year. And with Fitzpatrick coming back but being named the starter, we do look for him to throw maybe 1 to 2 picks. And Deshaun Jackson, he's been up and down so far this year. He had 9 points. He's only had 4 touchdowns, but 2 of those came in week 1 against New Orleans. So other than that, he's only had 1 touchdown, and he's had 2 games over 100 yards. So his catching or reception numbers are 4, 2, and 3. So he is a boom or bust player for you, and I'm looking for him to bust this week. And then Rams against New Orleans. This is, I don't know. I don't see them picking off Drew Brees. Maybe they'll get 1 pick, but I don't see too many turnovers coming from New Orleans. This is going to be a high-scoring game, so the Rams will probably get 4 to 7 points this week from your defense. But going against the Rams, the Saints, that's pretty good for your defense. Fairbairn, so he's had 10 points 2 weeks ago, 6 last week against Miami, but they're going against Denver in that thin, cold air up there at Denver. I look for him to maybe get 8 to 12 points or 8 to 10 points. So I'm picking Team Cortez. I'm putting my trust in you. But if Tobias Andrew-Davis gets a quarterback and throws Zeke in there, I don't know. I think it's still going to be close, but I just had to go with Team Cortez, especially with Andrew-Davis starting right now. 3 players who are going to get 0 points.
Yeah, if Andrew-Davis make the right moves here, this is going to be a fun matchup to watch like throughout the day tomorrow. This is one that I'm going to be keeping my eye on because it's the one where we're picking differently from each other. And right now, I think I'm 2 games back from you in total, so I can make up a game here if I get this one right and you get this one wrong. So, Andrew-Davis, man, if you are listening to this podcast, please make those moves, man. Do something. And just, you're projected 59 fantasy points from an ESPN projection, who they love projecting players to get way more points than they're going to. So 59 points is just horrible. Do something, bro, please. Moving on now to Dick Dangla versus Dalvin and the Chipmunks. We both have Dalvin and the Chipmunks winning this matchup. And I think for both of us, it comes down to both their tight ends played in the Thursday night game. Dick Dangla played Jared Cook, who got 3 fantasy points. He looked really good at the start of the game, but then Oakland fell apart, and he just didn't see any more targets and receptions throughout the game. Whereas on the other side, Dalvin and the Chipmunks started George Kittle, who got 18 fantasy points, had a monster game. He's had a monster year so far. He's really, I think, probably the fantasy breakout player of the year so far. I might be biased being a Niners fan, but I think he's an all-pro, first-team tight end type of guy. He's just a really, really good tight end and will be for years to come because he's only like 24 years old or something like that. I love that man. Dalvin and the Chipmunks, they're starting Patrick Mahomes, Dion Lewis, Isaiah Crowell, DeAndre Hopkins, Demaryius Thomas, George Kittle already played, Devin Funchess in their flex, the Bears defense, and then Will Lutz. So the rough spot for them is their running back position. Isaiah Crowell is very, very boom or bust. He does have a stranglehold on that starting running back spot now that Bilal Powell is on IR, but the past couple of weeks, he hasn't done that well. He saw 13 carries against Indy for 6 points. Minnesota, he saw 11 carries for 4.5 points. And then against Chicago last week, 13 carries for 25 yards and 3.5 fantasy points. He has not been good so far. Luckily, he is playing Miami, and they have been pretty bad against the run. They're 29th in the league against opposing running backs. They've had tons of injuries on that defense, making it way easier to run against them. So he could see a pretty decent game here. I think he might see a rushing touchdown on the goal line or something like that. I think 10 to 12 fantasy points is a pretty good projection here. Dion Lewis has been a really weird player to watch in fantasy so far this year against the Chargers in Week 7. They had a bye week last week, so in Week 7 he had 18 fantasy points. But the 2 weeks before that against Baltimore, 1 point. Against Buffalo, 3.5 points. Dallas's defense has been pretty good. Their defensive line is really strong. Their pass rush is really strong. But if the Titans are going to get anything going, it's going to be through Dion Lewis and his pass-catching ability. So I could see him getting 8 to 9 fantasy points in this matchup. If he gets a touchdown, that's like 14 fantasy points, so that'd be pretty good. In his wide receiver spot, this is probably his strength. So he's starting DeAndre Hopkins and Demaryius Thomas, who both play for Houston. They're both playing against Denver, who does have a really good passing defense, but they're the only two players on this team worth throwing the ball to, really. Kiki Kuti has been confirmed not traveling with the team, so he's out this week. So all the targets and receptions are probably going to go to Hopkins and Thomas. So I see both of them probably getting you a combined probably 20 receptions and probably 30 to 40 fantasy points between the two of them. George Kittle already got 18 fantasy points, so great start there. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background right now. Sorry about that, guys. In his flex, he's got Devin Funchess against Tampa Bay. This is a great situation for Devin Funchess. Tampa Bay's been terrible against opposing wide receivers. They're 31st in the league against opposing wide receivers, defense against opposing wide receivers. And I think Funchess sees quite a few red zone targets in this game. I don't think he'll get you 100 receiving yards. He hasn't done that once this year. But I think he probably sees 4 or 5 receptions for probably a touchdown or 2. And I'm thinking 15 to 16 fantasy points for him here. Then the Bears defense against Buffalo. This is a dream scenario for the Bears defense. Nathan Peterman is going to be starting. We all know the story with Nathan Peterman. He's one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. Throws interceptions every single time he plays. The Bears defense is really strong. This is a spot where the Bears defense could really, realistically get 20 to 30 fantasy points. And I don't think that's a crazy projection. Honestly, it's just such a good matchup for them. I think a pick 6 or a fumble 6 or something like that is in order. Khalil Mack is going to feast. Bears defense is really going to win him this matchup, I think. And then Will Lutz at kicker against the Rams. I think this game is going to be fairly high scoring. Will Lutz will probably get you 9 to 12 fantasy points here and have a pretty solid week for a kicker. This is just a week where Dick Dangla's team, he is 5-3. Dalvin and Chipmunks are 3-5, but Dick Dangla's team just looks a bit weaker right now compared. I don't like Isaiah Crowell for Dalvin and Chipmunks, but the rest of his team should be able to make up for that really, really low scoring game from Crowell.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of an interesting wrinkle with Demaryius Thomas. I think this is the first time ever in NFL history that a player has been traded to another team and then played his previous team the next week. So he's going to know all the offensive reads. He's told the defense every one of their audibles. They're giving them a week for Denver's offense to switch everything up just because Demaryius Thomas is going to do what that dude from Cleveland did on Hard Knocks for the Eagles.
Yeah, he's going to spill all the info.
Yeah, he's going to tell the weaknesses of all their players. So I look for Demaryius Thomas and DeAndre Hopkins to have a giant week this week, like you were saying, for Dalvin and the Chipmunks. Myself, I did pick Dalvin and the Chipmunks, so I'll talk about Dick Dangla a little bit. So Tom Brady against Green Bay, we already talked about how this might be the second, either the best or second best game of the week. With him and Aaron Rodgers going at it. I think that's just what it's going to be. I think it's going to be an offensive game, just each quarterback trying to outdo each other really at all. So I'm looking for him to get mid to high 20s this week and possibly breaking into the 30 area. Alvin Kamara against the Rams. So the Rams are, let's see, I think they're the first. They're 10th against running backs. But Alvin Kamara, ever since Mark Ingram's come back, his touchdown production has just plummeted. He's not getting those goal line touches that he had, so he's having to rely on scoring in space, which he's good at, but he hasn't been able to get that production that he has when he was still scoring at the goal line. So I think that he's closer to maybe a 10, 15 point, maybe 12 to 18 point production, which is pretty decent. TJ Yeldon's in your running back position, and he's on a bye. So I looked at your bench. Alfred Morris already played. He got you 1 point. Good job not switching him out. But your only other running back on your bench is Capri Bibbs for Washington. And unless Adrian Peterson gets hurt, he probably won't get any looks at all. So I don't see that you can do anything besides dropping someone and picking someone up off the waiver wires. But, yeah, TJ Yeldon is not playing, so he's going to get you 0 points. So that's just, again, with Jared Cook getting you 3 and then TJ Yeldon right now getting you 0, that's 3 points out of 2 players. And you just can't win like that. You can't win not starting players that aren't going to be on a bye. You got to start players that are going to play, and this is when you got to make some tough decisions for free agents and maybe drop a player that you really like. You got Devontae Adams and Emmanuel Sanders. So Devontae Adams is fully healthy against New England, so I do like this matchup. We already talked about how this should be a tough game, just a grinder game, going high scoring. And so New England is 13th against wide receivers, but with Cobb being kind of banged up, I do like this matchup for Devontae Adams. He is Aaron Rodgers' go-to guy, so I do like this matchup. And then Emmanuel Sanders, there's nothing bad you can say about this guy, especially with Demaryius Thomas leaving. It's just him and Sutton left, so he's got to get his. He did have a down week last week against Kansas City. We talked about how their defense has turned it back around a little bit. He only had 7 points last week, but besides that, he's averaging 15 points overall this year. So I looked for him to get just that, 15 points. Jared Cook in your tight end position, we talked about, he's only got 3 points against San Francisco. Ever since, really, it's sad what's happening with that Oakland team. But Jared Cook, he's only had 2 games over 20 points. Besides that, he's had 1 over 10. So, hey, it's either he does really good or he does really bad with only 6 points, 4 points, 2 points, and now 3 points over those 4 weeks. It's not looking good for Jared Cook in that offense as a whole. He's playing Cole Beasley against Tennessee, who's Cole Beasley right now. He's averaging 9 points, which in your flex, that's decent. That's what you want to see. You want to see closer to 12 points, but hey, 9 will do the job. But it's with the rest of your team, though, it's not looking a good week for you. You're playing Steelers against Baltimore, so we already talked about how this will be a grinder, so this could be good for Steelers. It's going to be a game where I see both teams scoring in the teens, maybe low 20s, which that's not going to be bad for your defense, but you got to get some turnovers, which they have not been able to do so far this year, and especially against Baltimore. Joe Flacco does not like to throw the ball away, so you're going to have to get a fumble by one of their running backs, either Collins or Buck Allen. But yeah, I'm not seeing that really. So Steelers maybe getting 6 points, 5 to 6 points this week, and then Graham Gano. So he shot out of a cannon with 19 points 2 weeks ago. But besides that, he has 3 points, 1 point. Then 15 points against Baltimore. But they're playing Tampa Bay. I do like this for him on the extra point wise. I don't see him getting a lot of field goals, maybe 2, but extra points he can get 5 to 6. I look for Carolina's offense to score a lot of points against Tampa Bay. So sadly, I'm going against you, Dick Dangler. I'm picking Dalvin and the Chipmunks. So this will even it out a little bit. So Dalvin and the Chipmunks is 3-5. So if they win, they'll be 4-5. And if Dick Dangler loses, he'll be 5-4. So this is one of the games that will help even out the league a little bit and help me make the playoffs.
I think most of our picks this week will really help even out the league. There's just so many teams outside of Lucky Neckbeards. Everyone is in contention to make the playoffs still. It's kind of insane. There isn't a team that's worse than 3-5 right now.
Yep.
That is absolutely nutty. And if everything goes the way we think it's going to go, everything's going to stay pretty even as well. The Lucky Neckbeards will start running away with this league and look like the favorite to win it all. But any one of these teams, as far as my team, your team, Stairway to Evans, and maybe Dick Dangla once his team gets healthy again, like any of those teams could sneak out a championship here. This is a really exciting year for our league right now. There's really outside of Neckbeards, no favorite. So it's really interesting to watch and something I'm having a lot of fun playing in this league this year. There's been a lot of trades too. It's been pretty awesome.
So it looks like the game that we disagreed on was Tobias Anarepas versus Cortez. Hopefully Anarepas does not look at his lineup at all, but I'm pretty sure you already sent him a text. So let's go Team Cortez and pull this win out for me. But I think that'll do us for this week. So like I said, we're going to try and push this episode out tonight immediately. That way whoever of you guys actually listen to this podcast can listen to it and adjust your lineups. Hopefully it's not Anarepas because he'll fix his lineup. But yeah, so I'm Matt Bowen.
And I'm Daniel Powell.
And this is Just Two Assholes Fantasy Football Podcast. Remember, 2 assholes are better than 1.